The British monarchy is one of the oldest and most famous royal institutions in the world, with a history that spans over 1,000 years. The story begins in early medieval England, where kings ruled through power, land, and loyalty. In 1066, everything changed with the Norman Conquest, when William the Conqueror defeated the English army and became king. This event shaped the future of the English crown forever. During the Middle Ages, monarchs ruled with near absolute power. Kings lived in castles, led armies into battle, and controlled the land. However, in 1215, a historic moment occurred when King John signed the Magna Carta. This document limited the power of the king and laid the foundation for modern democracy. The monarchy faced great challenges during the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war between rival royal families. From this chaos emerged the Tudor dynasty, including Henry VIII, one of the most powerful and controversial kings in British history. His reign changed England's religion and royal authority forever. The Tudor era reached its peak under Queen Elizabeth I, whose reign is known as a golden age of exploration, culture, and national strength. England became a major global power. In the 17th century, conflict between the monarchy and Parliament led to the English Civil War. King Charles the Fierce was executed, shocking the world and proving that even a king was not above the law. Although the monarchy was later restored, it was never the same again. The Victorian era, under Queen Victoria, marked the height of the British Empire. Britain ruled vast territories across the globe, and the monarchy became a symbol of unity and tradition rather than absolute power. In the 20th century, the royal family survived world wars, political change, and media pressure. Queen Elizabeth II, the longest reigning monarch in British history, became a global symbol of stability and service. Today, under King Charles III, the British monarchy continues to evolve. While its power is mostly symbolic, its cultural influence remains enormous. From medieval kings to modern royalty, the British monarchy's story is one of power, survival, and adaptation, a living link between the past and the present.
The British royal family we know today are just one generation amongst a remarkable monarchy, spanning over 1,000 years. But how did an ancestry that once ruled the lands eventually forfeit power? With over a millennium of bloody succession wars, global conquests, betrayals, and grand stone buildings still standing tall, all royal history has been documented and preserved. With countless kings and queens, each with their own stories, this is the entire history of the British monarchy. Our story doesn't begin with the Scots, or with the English for that matter, but with a Saxon prince named Egbert III. At the time of Egbert III's birth in 771 AD, England did not exist. Instead, the British Isles looked like this: a patchwork of warring kingdoms made up of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Britons, all fighting one another for control and influence over the Dominion. Born to Ealhmund, King of Kent, and grandson of Aoife, King of Wessex, the young Prince Egbert had strong claims to both territories. His father died when Egbert was 10, and a bloody scramble for the crown ensued. It eventually came to rest on the head of Beothric of Mercia. A young Egbert challenged Beothric's rule and lost.
I understand.
Forced to take refuge in the nearby court of Mercia, and eventually sent into exile in Francia, Egbert was forced to bide his time. Learning from the French courts of Charlemagne and gaining experience as a military leader on the continent, Egbert grew into a king who was about to change the course of English history. In 800 AD, after the death of Beothric, Egbert crossed the Channel, returning to the land of his father, and made his claim to the throne of Wessex. Despite overwhelming support in both Europe and within the Wessex nobility, Egbert's ascension was by no means easy. Threats from nearby kingdoms were constant, and after losing his brother-in-law on the day of his ascension to an invading army of Mercians, Egbert was finally crowned King of Wessex in 802 AD. Immediately, he set about consolidating his power. He took control of the kingdoms of Kent, Essex, Sussex, and Cornwall, as well as large swaths of Wales. Even the kingdom of Northumbria eventually submitted to the crown of Wessex, placing all Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain. under the direct and indirect rule of Egbert of Wessex. Well, almost all. His old enemy, the Kingdom of Mercia, was a different story. The two sides had been locked in a constant state of warfare for centuries, with each kingdom trading territory and blood as the years wore on. King Egbert of Wessex would see brief success driving the King of Mercia, Wiglaf, out of his lands, but he was unable to hold them, and Wiglaf returned only a year later. Despite this, though, the Anglo-Saxon chronicles remember Egbert favorably. For his role in uniting the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Britain, they bestowed onto him the title of Bretwalda, or Wide Ruler of Britain. And while he was never able to fully conquer the Mercian crown, his rule changed the landscape of Britain forever. Egbert of Wessex set in motion a policy of consolidation and expansion that his offspring would continue to enforce for the next 200 years, eventually leading to the unification of Britain and the birth of England. But there's still a lot of mess before we get there. King Egbert of Wessex died in 839 AD and was succeeded by his eldest son Ethelwulf, who soon faced a new threat, the Danes. Adorned in animal skins and brandishing axes stained with blood, the Danish invasion officially began in 842 AD. While Ethelwulf was victorious at the Battle of Aclea in 851 AD, driving the Danes back into the seas, he knew that this was just the beginning. The new threat worried the kingdoms of Britain so much that it forced Mercia and Wessex into an uneasy alliance with one another, putting an end to an almost 300-year conflict. Ethelwulf was succeeded by his son Ethelbald, whose reign was short and unpopular, especially amongst the clergy. This was mainly because of the new king's decision to marry his father's widow, something that even at this time was considered weird. After just 4 years of rule, Ethelbald died, passing the crown of Wessex onto his younger brother, Adalbert. Like his father before him, Adalbert too was threatened by foreign invaders from the north. Viking raids along the coast, led by Ragnar Lodbrok and his son Ivar the Boneless, had been growing in violence and frequency, with Viking forces even sacking the Wessex capital of Winchester in 865 AD. Adalbert rallied his troops and drove the Vikings back, but died of unknown causes that autumn, leaving the throne to his younger brother, Aethelred I, who was about to inherit an island on the verge of a major upheaval. The same year of Aethelred's ascension, 867 AD, the Vikings captured and settled the town of York, establishing the first major Danish foothold on English soil. Aethelred had no choice but to meet the great heathen army in battle. Together with his younger brother Alfred, they gathered an army and marched out to defeat their invaders. The cautious King Aethelred was defeated at the Battle of Reading in 871 AD, but was saved by his younger brother at the Battle of Ashdown the same year. Impatient as only the young are, Alfred took his army while King Aethelred prayed and met the Danes in open battle. He pushed the Viking horde back and bought his brother's kingdom some time, but the Danes rallied and struck the armies of Wessex again, securing victories at the battles of Basing and Merton. Aethelred died from his wounds, leaving the throne to his younger brother Alfred, who now inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse. In 874 AD, the great heathen army marched on the kingdom of Mercia, defeating Burgred of Mercia and forcing the king into exile. With Mercia defeated, all that stood between the northern invaders and total control of England was Alfred and the kingdom of Wessex. As Danish forces closed in all around him, Alfred was pushed back and forced into a remote marsh in Somerset. He'd been betrayed by his allies, who now chose to negotiate with the invaders rather than fight. Total Danish control of Britain looked imminent, but the young king had not given up hope. He emerged from the marsh and surprised the Danish army in Eddington, chasing the Danish king Guthrum back to his base in Chippenham and forcing the Danes into a siege. Guthrum held out for 2 weeks before he surrendered to Alfred's forces, and Alfred was victorious. The terms were simple. Guthrum was to leave Wessex and receive a Christian baptism. The Danish king obliged, and after his baptism was solemnized at Wedmore, he retreated to East Anglia, leaving Alfred to consolidate his gains. Victorious, Alfred took on a new name, Alfred the Great. With the Viking threat tamed, Alfred set about transforming Anglo-Saxon society for the better. He established fortified towns throughout his kingdom, built schools, and encouraged the acquisition of knowledge. There's even an unsubstantiated myth that he founded Oxford University. But perhaps his most important policy was the establishment of Dane law. England was to be divided. The south and east belonged to the Saxons, and Saxon law applied, while the north and west belonged to the Danes, and thus were subject to Dane law. This divide is still seen culturally, politically, and financially in Britain today. Alfred brought Anglo-Saxon England into a golden age. He tamed the Danish threat and kickstarted a new age of Saxon rule that permanently changed the landscape of Britain forever. Alfred the Great was succeeded by his son, Edward the Elder, in 899 AD. Edward was in many ways like his father, learned, pious, and a keen military tactician. His reign focused on 2 things: improving the administration of his lands and increased expansion both north and south. He was able to capture the Viking capital of York, but only held it for a year before he was forced to abandon it. He also successfully defeated the Viking presence in southern England, and now either directly or indirectly ruled over all the old kingdoms, barring Northumbria, which was still under Viking control. Edward the Elder died in 924 AD from wounds he received while quashing a Mercian rebellion in Chester, and passed his crown onto his son, Athelstan. After consolidating his power at home, Athelstan set his sights north and did what his father could not. He conquered the kingdom of Northumbria and took control of the Viking capital of York, conquering the last Viking territory on the island and pushing the Danes into Scotland. He continued his campaign into the Scottish territories, and after heavy losses on both sides, he emerged victorious at the Battle of Brunanburh, forcing the Scottish king to pledge overlordship to him. This made him the first true ruler over all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain, with his control extending from the shores of Cornwall up to the highlands of Scotland. By uniting the Anglo-Saxons, Athelstan formed the Kingdom of England and is thus remembered as the first real English king. With the realm now firmly under his control, King Athelstan continued the policies and reforms of his grandfather, Alfred the Great. He centralized government, brought about massive legal reform in the realm, and concerned himself with European politics in a way his predecessors seldom had. He died in 939 AD, passing the throne onto his half-brother, Edmund the Magnificent. Edmund's reign would be almost entirely focused on keeping his half-brother's kingdom together. He faced continuous threats from the Danish, who had now settled north of the border. Shortly after Edmund's ascension, they revolted against the new king, retaking York and mounting destructive raids on the Midlands. But like his predecessor, Edmund the Magnificent wasn't to be messed with. Leading his army north, he briefly stopped to quash a Welsh rebellion that had been brewing since before Athelstan's death. He then defeated the Danes at the Siege of Leicester and sent his armies into Scotland, seeking revenge against the King of Strathclyde for his decision to side with the Danish during the recapturing of York. He deposed the King of Strathclyde and installed Malcolm I of Scotland on the condition that Edmund would have overlordship of the territory. This gave Edmund control, directly and indirectly, of the entire island of Great Britain. But for all his successes, Edmund the Magnificent could not escape a violent death. In 946 AD, while attending a St. Augustine's Mass in Gloucestershire, Edmund was attacked and killed by a thief named Leofa, who the king had previously banished for his crimes. Edmund the Magnificent was buried at Glastonbury Abbey, and the realm scrambled to find his successor. Since Edmund's two sons were too young to rule, the burden of the crown fell to Edmund's brother, Edred, who reigned for 9 years before succumbing to an unknown intestinal illness in 955 AD. Edmund's eldest son, Edwig, was now 15 and took the crown as his own. He decided to split the realm between himself and his younger brother, Edgar, ruling everything south of the River Thames, while Edgar ruled the north. King Edwig's reign was short, with the young king dying just 4 years after his coronation. He passed the Kingdom of England in its entirety to his younger brother, Edgar the Peaceful, in 959 AD. His reign was, as the name might suggest, considered a peaceful golden age where England was free from external attacks and internal disorder. He introduced a standardized coinage and was at the helm of the English Benedictine religious reforms that swept across the realm. But this peace did not last. His death in 975 AD thrust England back into a period of conflict and uncertainty. The throne was disrupted by Edgar's two remaining sons, Edward the Martyr and Ethelred the Unready. Edward successfully took the throne in 975 AD, but was murdered just 4 years later in circumstances not totally clear to us today. His younger brother Ethelred soon took charge at just 12 years old. Before the young king had even a hair on his chin, an old enemy reared from far in the north. The Danes had returned and set about raiding English territories again. With every year, the threat grew more serious, and soon the English king could not afford to ignore them any longer. He gathered his armies and marched north, but was eventually defeated at the Battle of Malden. Seeking a compromise, King Ethelred II was forced to pay off the Danish king and leave them to settle in the Kingdom of Northumbria. But, as it turns out, the king was not content to just let the invaders be. A decade after his defeat, he ordered the infamous St. Brice's Day Massacre, a brutal slaughtering of a Danish settlement which had dire consequences to not only his rule, but his entire family's place in history. Hearing of the attack on his people, King Svein Forkbeard of Denmark sailed to England, forcing Ethelred to flee to Normandy in 1013 AD. Svein Forkbeard ruled over England for just 4 weeks before his sudden and mysterious death. Seizing the opportunity, Ethelred returned and quickly retook control of the crown. Despite the brief Danish interruption, Ethelred's 37-year reign was the longest of any Anglo-Saxon king, and it would become the last period of royal stability until the 12th century, almost 100 years later. King Ethelred the Unready died in 1016 AD. And the crown was passed on to his son, Edmund Ironside, who, like so many of those before him, was now forced to clean up the mess his father had made. You see, unbeknownst to Edmund, the Danish king Svein had a son, Canute the Great, who had been amassing an army in Denmark and preparing it to sail to England. Just weeks after the death of his father, and with the coronation wine barely out of his system, Edmund was forced to meet Canute and the Danes in battle. He was unsuccessful. With Edmund wounded, the two reached an agreement. Edmund Ironside was to rule Wessex, while Canute could have the rest of the country. This was October 30th. By November 18th, Edmund was dead, and Canute assumed kingship over the entire realm. After 214 years of hegemony, the House of Wessex had officially lost its control over England, ruling uninterrupted since Egbert III in 802 AD. 1016 would prove to be the dawn of a new age on the British Isles, the Age of Danes. After centuries of Danish activity on the island, a Danish king now sat on the English throne. Canute the Great was crowned in 1016 AD and wasted no time proving he was an astute leader and capable king. He understood that to rule the English, he would need their help. He appointed English counselors and clergymen, choosing to uphold the traditional customs and values of the land he'd inherited rather than to suppress them. He married the widow of Ethelred the Unready and allied himself closely to the church, all of which helped Canute cement his legitimacy in 1017 AD. In 1018, he was crowned King of Denmark and later conquered Sweden, uniting the three kingdoms to create the North Sea Alliance. Medieval historians look back on Canute's reign favorably. His presence brought stability to England and allowed the realm to flourish now that the threat of Viking raiders had been eliminated. He died in 1035 AD, and the crown was to be given to his son, Harold Harefoot. Harold had not been the first choice for succession, but with his older brother Harthacnut stuck in Norway dealing with a Swedish rebellion, therefore it was decided that Harold would be appointed king instead. This was not a popular decision, and many in the realm opposed it, most notably Godwin the Earl of Wessex and Emma of Normandy, Harold's stepmother and the widow of Ethelred the Unready. She'd had two other sons while with Ethelred, both of whom had been exiled to Normandy after the Danish conquest. But now, with Harthacnut absent and Harold struggling to consolidate his power, she called on them to return to England and take back their father's throne. Alfred the Noble and Edward the Confessor sailed across the Channel with a large army and sought support from the House of Wessex. But Godwin, who'd initially opposed Harold's claim to the throne, betrayed the young princes and seized Alfred the Noble with the aim of delivering him to Harold Harefoot. Fearing he would be next, Edward the Confessor fled back to Normandy, this time taking his mother with him to safety. During his captivity, Alfred the Noble was blinded and eventually succumbed to his wounds in 1036 AD. Harold would rule for just 4 more years before dying in 1040. Hearing of his half-brother's passing, Harthacnut returned from Scandinavia and crowned himself King of England that same year. But like his brother, his reign too would be short, and he died in 1042 AD from an unknown illness. He had no sons, and during the last years of his life, perhaps encouraged by his mother Emma of Normandy, he called his half-brother Edward the Confessor back from exile and named him as his heir. King Harthacnut's passing would mark the last time a Dane sat on the English throne. With Edward now on the throne, England was once again ruled by an Anglo-Saxon king. Except, Edward was only really Anglo-Saxon by blood. He'd spent 25 years of his life in exile in Normandy, and as a result, had an extremely Norman outlook on things. He appointed Norman counselors and Norman church leaders, and opted to speak French as opposed to Old English. He is best remembered as the founder of Westminster Abbey, still a major landmark in use in London today. As his life drew to an end, and with no sons to succeed him, Edward was expected to choose an heir. He was left with 2 options: Harold Godwinson, a prominent Earl of Wessex, and William, Duke of Normandy. Choosing Harold made more political sense. He was Anglo-Saxon and came from a prominent family, with ties to both the court of King Edward the Confessor and the former Danish king, Canute the Great. Meanwhile, William had been an aide to Edward during his exile in Normandy and was related to the Anglo-Saxon king through Emma of Normandy, who was his aunt. The issues that arose from Edward the Confessor's succession was that it wasn't clear what the king had wanted. There are rumors that he'd promised the throne to William, but those claims are unsupported. In 1065 AD, Edward the Confessor slipped suddenly into a coma, never clarifying who was to take over the English crown. Edward died on the 5th of January 1066. A day later, Harold was crowned King of England at the newly built Westminster Abbey. Upon hearing the news of Harold's ascension, William of Normandy was outraged and began preparing to invade the island. What followed was a brief period of warfare that was about to shape England forever. King Harold found himself in an unfavorable position. He knew of William's invasion force and gathered his armies along the coast, expecting the Norman Duke to set sail soon after he had been crowned. But William didn't. Bad weather made the channel too rough to sail across, and William was forced to postpone his invasion by several months. Back in England, and with provisions starting to run out, Harold was forced to disband his army and return to London. That same day, on the 8th of September 1066, a new threat appeared, only this time far up north. Harold Hardrada, King of Norway, had arrived in Northumbria and defeated the English earls in charge of protecting the northern kingdoms. Harold had no choice but to react. He hastily regrouped his army and began a forced march north of nearly 400 kilometers to meet the Viking invaders. It took 4 days for King Harold and his men to reach modern-day Yorkshire, but on the 25th of September, they faced off against the Norwegian army at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Just outside the city of York, the English army clashed with the Norse invaders. Hardrada was killed and Harold emerged victorious, stopping the invasion dead in its tracks. But Harold had little time to rest. Just 2 days after his victory at Stamford Bridge, word reached the king that the Norman invasion fleet had finally set sail for England. He gathered what men he had left and began the 400-kilometer march back to the English capital. Meanwhile, William of Normandy and around 7,000 men landed at Pevensey Bay in East Sussex and quickly took control of the old Roman fortifications nearby. It took King Harold and his army a week to reach the southern English coast, and Harold hoped his speech would catch William and his men by surprise. But Norman scouts had spotted Harold's army moving down and warned William of the king's arrival. On October 14th, 1066, a date forever etched in the annals of British history, the two armies clashed. The battle began at 9 a.m. and lasted the entire day. The English shield walls initially stood strong, surprising the Norman Duke and forcing him back, but William had come prepared. While Harold had only foot soldiers, the Norman Duke had brought with him cavalry and archers to supplement his main force. The Norman army feigned a retreat, which prompted the English troops to rush forward. This allowed the Norman cavalrymen to rout the disorganized English foot soldiers and slaughter them where they stood. Harold, the last Anglo-Saxon king of England, was killed by an arrow which struck him in the eye. Harold's mother reportedly begged William for her son's body back, offering to pay his weight in gold for custody of her son's corpse. But William refused. Legend has it he threw the body into the ocean, allowing the waves of the English Channel to swallow the Saxon king, never to be seen again. William of Normandy was victorious. He marched on London, burning his way through southern England and forcing lords to swear fealty to him as he went. He was crowned on Christmas Day 1066, marking the beginning of the Norman Age of England. His ascension to the English throne earned the Norman Duke a new name, William the Conqueror. As king by conquest, William now faced the unenviable challenge of consolidating his power. He brutally punished those who had stood against him by confiscating their lands, removing their royal titles, and executing anyone he deemed a threat to his rule. Families that had remained neutral during the invasion or were quick to pledge their support to William after it were rewarded and allowed to continue operating as they had before. Some were even allowed to marry into the new royal family. But a change in leadership was not all William brought with him. One of his most enduring policies was the construction of motte and bailey castles throughout his kingdom. Initially made from wood and later rebuilt with stone, these fortifications became the landmark feature of William's rule in England. From Pevensey, where he first landed, to as far north as modern-day Newcastle, these buildings were a sign of William's strength and influence over the land. Historians estimate that around 500 of these castles were built within the first 20 years of Norman rule alone, and they gave William and those loyal to him a position from which to defend themselves against revolts and usurpers, of which there were many. William's first test came when his former ally Eustace, the Count of Boulogne, rebelled at Dover. Unhappy with his spoils of the conquest, he rallied local troops against the king and attempted to take Dover Castle. But he failed and was forced to return the land he had won. Next, the king was faced with a number of English rebellions further inland. There was Edric the Wild in Wessex, as well as Githa, mother of Harold Godwinson, organizing revolts as south as Exeter. William dealt with those rebellions swiftly and with relatively little bloodshed. But in 1069 AD, the North rose up in revolt, and William responded in what would later be known as the Harrying of the North. It was a put-down so brutal that it left the areas of York and Durham underpopulated for centuries after. But his show of force had done its job. England was now firmly in his control. With this stability, the king felt confident enough to travel between England and the continent with increasing frequency. After 1072, he gave up making the journey and spent the majority of his time in Normandy, leaving England to be ruled by his half-brother Odo of Bayeux and his wife Matilda of Flanders. It was during this time that the first ever national census was conducted in England. The dramatically named Domesday Book was, in effect, a royal survey of all the lands in England simply for administrative and tax purposes. Its name derives from the Christian Day of Judgment, and the aim of the project was to streamline and regulate tax collection in the realm. Its historical relevance cannot be understated, as it gave historians an incredibly detailed look into what life was like at the time of the Norman invasion, and it currently lives in the National Archives at Kew in London. A year after the book was completed, on the 9th of September 1087 AD, William the Conqueror died of dysentery while on expedition in France. As was the custom of the time, he divided his properties between his 3 living sons. Robert got Normandy, William got England, and Henry got money. While the new King William may have inherited his father's lands and name, he had unfortunately inherited little else. Crowned king a month after his father's death, he quickly established himself as an unpopular, greedy, and self-centered ruler. He was a poor administrator who frequently angered the church and provoked his nobility with an unpredictable temperament and unyielding attitude. It's perhaps no surprise then that after 13 years of rule, King William II met his end during a hunting accident, the details of which aren't totally clear, but it is reported that William stepped in front of a stray arrow, dying of his wounds on the spot. The man who shot the arrow, William Tyrrell, fled after giving his account of the ordeal. With King William II dead, the throne was to be passed on to his older brother, Robert, Duke of Normandy. But Henry, the youngest of the 3, had other ideas. With Robert busy on the continent ruling as Duke of Normandy, Henry took control of the royal treasury in London and proclaimed himself King of England in 1100 AD. Robert did eventually challenge his younger brother for the English throne, but King Henry was victorious at the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. Defeated, Robert was stripped of his dukedom and would spend the rest of his life in prison. Thankfully for England, Henry I turned out to be a much better ruler than his brother before him. He successfully expanded royal administration throughout the realm, and further solidified the rule of law. He set up the Court of the Exchequer to directly handle all financial matters, something which greatly improved the processes of collecting taxes and granting charters. He ruled for 35 long, peaceful, and prosperous years, during a time of great social and political change on the island. Many of the administrators King Henry had appointed were new men, obscure, untitled subjects who had risen through the ranks through sheer brilliance and ability and not simply because of their names. But tragedy struck Henry during his twilight years. His son and eventual heir to the English throne, William Adelin, died in the wreck of the White Ship while returning from France. The widower Henry was forced to remarry in the hopes of having another son. When it became clear Henry would not bear another son, he decided to name his daughter Matilda as his successor to the throne. This was an unprecedented move, and while many barons publicly swore fealty to the future empress, privately they had other ideas. King Henry I died in 1135 AD, believing that he had solved the issue of succession. Immediately, however, the barons of England abandoned the dead king's wishes in favor of a different claimant, Henry's nephew, Stephen of Blois. You see, the English nobility weren't keen on the idea of a woman ruling the country. English society believed a woman simply couldn't rule as effectively as a man. Patriarchal biases aside, Stephen of Blois was a well-known and well-liked figure within the Anglo-Saxon upper class. He was respected, well-mannered, decisive, and best of all, wealthy, traits that made him an attractive prospect to put on the English throne. Matilda, meanwhile, was stubborn, arrogant, and because she had been married off at a young age to the Holy Roman Emperor and therefore spent her life away from England, she was considered by many a foreigner. What followed was a period of English history that later came to be known as the Anarchy. The news of King Henry's death reached Stephen of Blois first, and he crossed the Channel and crowned himself king in 1135 AD, arguing that the stability of the land took precedence over any earlier commitments to support Matilda as Henry's heir. Matilda, who now was married to the Count of Anjou, was still in Europe, and news of her father's passing was slow to reach her. As a result, King Stephen enjoyed an early period of ruling that was free of turmoil and challenge. When news reached Matilda of Stephen's usurpation, she was furious. In 1139, she crossed the Channel and traveled to the court of her half-brother, Robert the Earl of Gloucester, seeking his support against the usurper king. Robert obliged. Trouble began in 1141 when the king's forces met Robert's army at the Battle of Lincoln. King Stephen is said to have fought bravely but was overwhelmed by Robert's men. The captured king was then taken to speak with Matilda. She immediately imprisoned Stephen at Bristol Castle and set out for London with one aim in mind, her coronation. But her attempts at becoming queen were soon halted. She faced bitter opposition from the crowds that had gathered in the capital. These were not soldiers, but ordinary citizens. Forced to retreat, her half-brother Robert was captured during the Rout of Winchester, and only by releasing King Stephen did Empress Matilda secure her half-brother's safety. With Stephen free once again, the fighting continued. Empress Matilda was herself captured at the town of Devizes, but managed to slip away from the king's men by pretending to be a corpse on a cart. She was again captured and this time held at Oxford Castle, but Matilda mounted another daring escape, lowering herself from the castle walls on a rope during a snowstorm. Wearing white so as to camouflage herself, the Empress traversed the bitter cold and made her way to the town of Wallingford by night, making sure to avoid detection from hastily formed search parties that hoped to find her. The war soon turned into a stalemate as neither side could claim they controlled much of anything. In 1153, Matilda's son Henry landed in England and began building his own alliances with power barons to support his mother's claim to the throne. But Empress Matilda had grown tired of the fighting and by now had retreated to Normandy, passing her claim solely on to her son. King Stephen was in a similar position with his rule undermined by the constant fighting, so he agreed to the Treaty of Westminster. It stated that King Stephen would remain king for life, and then Henry, the lawful heir, would succeed him as King of England upon his death. As it turns out, Stephen only lived for another year and died in 1154 AD, passing the English throne to Henry. From the ashes of the Civil War, England was reborn under a new family, one that would eventually rule over the island for almost half a millennia. Introducing the Plantagenets. Henry II was crowned King of England on the 19th of December 1154 AD, and immediately set about fixing his kingdom. 18 years of civil war had taken its toll, and the realm his grandfather had ruled over less than a lifetime ago was now unrecognizable. The treasury was virtually empty, royal administration was almost non-existent, and local lords had slowly wrestled power away from the crown, weakening its influence in the realm. Henry began by restoring the power of royal administrations, as well as re-establishing English hegemony over Wales. He razed unlicensed castles that had sprung up during the Anarchy, and reclaimed many of the rights and powers the crown had lost during the reign of King Stephen. Next, Henry focused on restoring the crown's finances. The war had disrupted almost all the king's traditional sources of income, and as a result, Henry inherited a kingdom that had lost an estimated 46% of its funding. Faced with an administrative nightmare, the king needed help. He was soon introduced to a cleric from London who had earned a reputation as an astute and capable administrator. His name was Thomas Becket. Ruthlessly efficient and brilliant at this post, Becket was appointed Lord Chancellor in 1155, giving him direct control over the king's sources of revenue. Becket was successful at his new post, and King Henry had a lot of admiration for the Chancellor. As a new man, Becket championed the idea set forward by Henry's grandfather, that of promotion through ability and not title. And even beyond this, the two men quickly became friends. The king even sent his son Henry to live in the Becket household as a young boy, highlighting just how close the two families really were. So, when the Archbishop of Canterbury died, Henry saw a golden opportunity. Wanting to reassert his rights over the church in England, which had been growing increasingly powerful in recent years, King Henry II encouraged a reluctant Thomas Becket to take up the position of Archbishop. It was a win-win for Henry. Becket was a powerful chancellor, and his new position as Archbishop would weaken him politically, meaning Becket would have to rely more on King Henry for support. Moreover, Henry assumed his old friend would act in the crown's best interest, weakening the church's growing influence over the Kingdom of England. But he was wrong. Almost immediately after his ordination in 1162 AD, Thomas Becket changed. He abandoned his links to the royal family and fashioned himself as a new protector of religious rights. Henry's plan had backfired enormously. Their friendship did little to stop them from clashing on a number of issues, mainly the question of the supremacy of ecclesiastical courts. Put simply, during Henry's reign, clergy members could only be tried for their crimes in church courts. The king didn't like this, as it made the crown appear weak and subservient, implying that the church and its clergy were above royal ordinance. Add to this the fact that a huge portion of England's administrative body was made up of clergymen, and Henry was anxious to wrestle power back from the church. He argued that criminous clerks should be tried in royal courts instead. Becket disagreed. This enraged King Henry II, who was known for having a wild and unpredictable temperament. Fearing for his life, Archbishop Becket fled to France, where the Pope was forced to intervene, mediating a fragile peace between the old friends. Upon his return, Becket immediately angered Henry by excommunicating the bishops who had supported the king during the archbishop's exile. Henry flew into another rage, and 4 knights, perhaps hoping to curry favor from the king, rode to Canterbury and killed Becket on the steps of his altar where he stood. It was a shocking move, and one that Henry came to deeply regret. Filled with remorse, King Henry walked to Canterbury Cathedral in sackcloth and ashes, allowing himself to be whipped by the monks there. Becket was martyred, and the power of the church grew as a consequence. Henry's own demise would eventually come at the hands of his 3 sons. In 1173, the heir to the English throne, young Henry, rebelled against his father. Joined by his 2 brothers, Richard and Geoffrey, as well as several European states, the Great Revolt began, and King Henry II was forced to meet the rebels in battle. The revolt was only stopped thanks to Henry's talented local commanders, many of whom were new men appointed for their loyalty and administrative skill. Young Henry and Geoffrey led another revolt a decade later in 1183, but they were again unsuccessful and died a few years after. Philip II, King of France, swayed a neutral Richard to his side, and together they led one last revolt against King Henry II of England. With his army defeated, the king retreated to his castle in Anjou, where he died from a bleeding ulcer shortly after in 1189. Having forced his father off the throne, Richard prepped himself to take over. Richard I was crowned king at Westminster Abbey on the 3rd of September 1198. Fondly remembered in English history as Richard the Lionheart for his bravery and skill in battle, Richard's rule is unique, as he spent the majority of it abroad fighting in what would later be known as the Third Crusades. In fact, King Richard spent just 10 months in England before leaving to join Philip II of France on his crusade to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim invaders. Richard proved himself to be a brilliant military strategist, and he fought cruelly and decisively as he led his army deep into the Levant. His rivalry with Muslim commander Saladin became the stuff of legend, and the Crusaders were able to recapture a sizable portion of their territory back. But as a result, England quickly became an afterthought to King Richard. He used the realm mainly to finance his wars in the Middle East. After failing to retake Jerusalem, King Richard was captured by Leopold of Austria, a personal enemy of the English king, and held for ransom. John, the youngest of Henry II's children and brother of Richard, had been left in administrative charge of the realm. When news reached him of his brother's capture, he was hesitant to pay the £60,000 ransom. With help from the Archbishop of Canterbury and his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, King Richard's ransom was paid and he was free once more. But Richard the Lionheart died as he lived, fighting. Struck by a crossbow bolt in France, the wound quickly turned gangrenous, and it was apparent to all that the king wouldn't make it. Richard reportedly asked to have the crossbowman brought before him and was surprised when a boy was thrown at his feet. The child said King Richard had killed his father and brother and that he had intended to kill Richard in revenge. He expected to be executed, but in one final act of mercy, Richard the Lionheart forgave him, saying, "Live on, and by my bounty, behold the light of day." Richard died in his mother's arms on the 6th of April, 1199. Chroniclers of this time said this of the king's death: "The lion by the ant was slain." With his brother now dead, John was crowned King of England in 1199 AD. Like his older brother before him, John too was given a nickname, although one far less romantic. He was called John Lackland, or Lack of Land, as he was not expected to inherit any significant lands upon his father's death. But as fate would have it, as the youngest of Henry II's 4 sons, John had not been involved in any of the wars against his father, and had therefore been given lands in Ireland and France as a thank you for his loyalty. Unfortunately, though, this was about as good as it got for King John. While Richard the Lionheart was an absent but popular king, John was the complete opposite. He was a poor administrator, a greedy statesman, and a terrible fighter, whose over-involvement in ruling led to a sharp decline in the power of the English crown. In 1204, he lost all his family's lands on the continent, severing the aristocracy of Normandy from England for the first time since William the Conqueror's accession in 1066. He was briefly excommunicated in 1209 by Pope Innocent III after an argument with his clergy, and was becoming increasingly unpopular with the barons of England for his poor leadership and decision-making. After failing to recapture his territories of Normandy, King John was forced to return to England and face a powerful rebellion from his barons. Unhappy with the king's new fiscal policies and demanding that their rights as nobility be respected, they forced the king into signing the Great Document, or the Magna Carta, in 1215 AD. The English crown changed forever that day, as the king agreed to be bound by common law and tradition, especially where it affected the rights and privileges of the nobility. It essentially put the crown directly under the rule of law, as opposed to the other way around as it had been since England was founded. Its impact was astronomical, although not immediate. While it was nothing more than a power grab by the barons of England, it eventually went on to form the basis of the English Constitution, and included several clauses that were later interpreted as definitions of democratic freedom and the rights of an individual under common law. King John had hoped that by signing the Magna Carta, he could appease his nobility and stop a war from breaking out in the kingdom. But once again, he was wrong. Still unhappy with King John's rule, the First Barons' War ignited in England in 1215. But, despite backing from the King of France, the English barons were unable to score any decisive victories over King John and his men, and the war quickly became a stalemate. While on campaign, King John died of dysentery he'd contracted while overindulging on peaches. A fitting death, perhaps. As a result, the throne was passed on to his son Henry, who now had the unpleasant task of finishing what his father had started. At just 9 years of age, Henry III was crowned King of England on October 28, 1216. Inheriting a kingdom on fire, the new King Henry was faced with the challenge of ending the First Barons' War. The king's army was led by William Marshal, 1st Earl of Pembrokeshire, and servant to 5 English rulers before him. He was a brilliant commander and successfully defeated the Baron army at the Battle of Lincoln and the Battle of Sandwich that same year. With the barons defeated, they now had to answer to their new king. Henry showed great diplomacy and maturity by promising to abide by the Magna Carta, agreeing to limit his royal power and protect the rights of the nobility. With the rebellion quashed, Henry now turned his attention to repairing his kingdom. With the help of able statesmen and administrators, the next few years of King Henry's reign focused on regaining royal control that had been lost during the war. In 1230 AD, he had secured his power, and now well into adulthood, he set his sights on his father's greatest shame, their provinces in France. The English crown had never fully recovered from losing its grip on the Angevin Empire, and King Henry III sought to fix that. He prepared an invasion fleet, planning to take the territories by force and re-establish English control over land he deemed his birthright. But the invasion was a disaster. Perhaps on the advice of the 1st Earl of Kent, who had been ruling the realm on behalf of the young king while he was still coming of age, Henry avoided meeting the French in open battle and instead marched his troops across the countryside, forcing local barons and lords to pay homage to him. Some did, some didn't, and it was a pointless venture that didn't really mean much for English control in the region. Eventually, Henry was forced to return to England, having achieved nothing. As soon as Henry and his troops left France, those barons who had pledged themselves to him went right back to supporting the French king. The invasion had been a costly fiasco that made Henry extremely unpopular amongst his nobility. Hubert, 1st Earl of Kent, had now fallen out of favor with the king, and upon their return to England, Henry dismissed him, eventually imprisoning Hubert in the Tower of London. And the man chosen to replace him was no better. Peter de Roche took over as the king's justiciar and immediately set about reversing the policies of his predecessor. He stripped his enemies of land and wealth, circumventing the royal courts, and angering the nobility who believed that their rights were being infringed upon once again. Richard Marshal, the son of William Marshal, who had led the royal army in the First Barons' War, began to amass troops, only this time in support of the English barons. They argued that the king had again failed to protect their rights as outlined in the Magna Carta, and thus a new civil war broke out. Unable to gain a clear military advantage against the rebels, and with tension in France growing, King Henry had no choice. He agreed to the dismissal of Peter de Roche and submitted fully to the rebels' demands. King Henry had learned his lesson. Never again was England ruled through senior ministers, and the king now chose to administer the realm personally. The only problem was that Henry was not a good administrator. He filled the church with absentee Italian appointees, and much of the civil offices with French bureaucrats. Actions which unsurprisingly angered the nobility of England once more. This led to the barons to once again take action against the king. He was forced into signing the Provisions of Oxford, a document which gave barons the legal right to veto the king's decisions. Although initially supportive, King Henry tried to back out of the deal, which led to the Third Civil War of his reign. Led by Simon de Montfort, Henry's brother-in-law, the rebel army successfully captured King Henry at the Battle of Lewes in 1265. With the king now at his mercy, Simon called the first English Parliament into action. From the French word for talk, or parle, he summoned 2 knights from each shire and 2 burgesses from each borough for a discussion. The men talked and created a new system of government on the island that is still in use in England today. King Henry's eldest son, Edward Longshanks, so named for his lanky build, had been captured alongside his father at the Battle of Lewes. Shortly after the first parliamentary discussion, Edward escaped, and within a few short months, he had defeated Simon at the Battle of Evesham in 1265. The Second Barons' War ended shortly after, and Edward Longshanks left England with his father, King Henry, once again on the English throne. In 1275, King Henry III announced his intention to embark on the Crusades alongside his son, but died just a few months later. Edward was recalled from the continent and slowly made his way back to the English shores. Landing on the island in 1274, Edward Longshanks was crowned at Westminster Abbey shortly after becoming King of England, inheriting an island that had suffered through 3 major insurrections in the last 56 years. King Edward I had his work cut out for him. He immediately set about reforming royal administration and reinforcing common law, writing a series of statutes that regulated criminal and property law in the realm. Edward had also learned from his father's mistakes and was more supportive of the demands of his nobility. He regularly convened with knights and townspeople alike on matters that affected them and quickly proved to be an able and just ruler. But despite his focus on repairing England domestically, King Edward could not help but be drawn into foreign conflicts. The first was a revolt in Wales led by a Welsh chief named Llewellyn in 1282. Here, the royal army came face to face with the brutal efficiency of the Welsh longbowmen, and despite taking heavy losses, they subdued the rebel threat. In an attempt to exert more control over the region, King Edward constructed a series of castles in the Welsh territory and increased royal presence in the region. His son, Edward, was born in Wales in 1284 and was soon after named Prince of Wales, a title that the heir to the English throne still wears to this day. In 1291, another foreign conflict called his attention, this time at the northern border. Asked to arbitrate between 3 rival claimants to the Scottish throne, Edward chose to crown John Balliol. The only problem was that John Balliol had previously paid homage to the English king, thus ruining any impartiality Edward was supposed to have. This angered the lords of Scotland, who in turn allied themselves with France, leaving England threatened on all sides. King Edward then retaliated. Claiming feudal suzerainty over Scotland, he marched his army north and invaded, defeating Balliol in 1296 and taking the Scottish crown for himself. He also took the Stone of Scone, an important relic of Scottish nobility where all Scottish kings were crowned upon. The stone is still used to crown British monarchs today and currently resides at Westminster Abbey in London. For his actions in Scotland, King Edward earned himself a new nickname. Edward Longshanks had become Edward the Hammer of Scots. Back in England, Edward was overseeing a rapidly transforming English government. He encouraged petitions to Parliament, with councils sitting much more frequently than they had previously, and he continued to clarify the responsibilities of the different courts. Criminal and crown cases were handled by the Court of King's Bench. The Court of the Exchequer dealt with royal finance, and the Court of Common Plea handled more of the day-to-day cases between subjects. From these roots, a new profession sprouted: lawyers. Needing to keep his new courts running smoothly, he took the profession of law away from the clergy and formed a new social class of educated young men whose job was to learn the law away from the influence of the church. This led to the establishment of the Inns of Court, great mansions where students and barristers lived together. The barristers taught the students English common law, along with necessary social skills such as music and dancing. These Inns of Court also set the precedent for other collegiate systems around the country. It was during King Edward's reign that the academic system we know today as Oxford University was founded, building on the earlier schools established by Alfred the Great over 200 years before. King Edward I died of dysentery in 1307 while fighting the Scottish up north. There is a rumor that on his deathbed, Edward wished for his bones to be taken with the army while they continued their fight into Scotland. Another rumor claims that Edward wished for his heart to accompany the next Crusaders as they marched into the Holy Land once more. Regardless, What these stories show is that Edward very much considered himself a warrior king. While he was a successful military commander, it was his administrative actions that had the biggest impact on England as a whole. The introduction of lawyers mingled with the burgeoning merchant class to form a proto-middle class, where before there had been none. Parliament was strengthened and legitimized during his reign, and despite his warlike tendencies, King Edward's reign was peaceful and prosperous for the average Englishman. King Edward I was succeeded by his son, Edward II, who was crowned in 1307 at Westminster Abbey. While his father had immediately launched into fixing the realm he had inherited, Edward II had no need to. His father's kingdom was flourishing, bolstered by great social changes and the newly inherited Scottish crown. It was a stable territory that was emerging as one of the most powerful kingdoms in all of Europe. But despite its power and prestige, the new King Edward appeared to almost resent the English crown that now rested on his head. He grew bored of his royal responsibilities and quickly turned his attention towards other pursuits: young men. The first of these deep infatuations the king would come to have was with Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was arrogant and well aware of his position as the king's favorite, abusing his power and coming to blows with many of the other barons of England. He was a close companion to the king, accompanying him everywhere, but this wasn't well received by everyone. Soon, Gaveston's behavior angered the French royal family, to whom Edward II had married into through his wife, Isabella of France. With pressure mounting from both his nobility and the French crown, King Edward II was forced to exile Piers Gaveston. But this didn't last long. By 1307, Gaveston was back in England and once again at the king's side. Parliament met in 1308 with the king eager to discuss potential government reform, but the barons were unwilling to proceed until the issue of Gaveston had been dealt with. The king was initially dismissive, and a violent outcome seemed inevitable, but after the Archbishop of Canterbury threatened to have Gaveston excommunicated, Edward miraculously yielded. Gaveston was to be sent to Aquitaine, away from England, for good. Unsurprisingly though, this did not last. The king once again recalled Gaveston, angering the barons and sparking an insurrection. After a period of cat and mouse between the king and the armies of his nobility, Gaveston was eventually captured at Scarborough Castle and taken to Warwick, where he was tried as a traitor. Gaveston was beheaded on the authority of the Earl of Lancaster. The king was reportedly inconsolable. Still reeling from the death of his friend, Edward was decisively defeated at the Battle of Bannockburn by Robert the Bruce, and after just 18 years of English rule, Scotland gained its independence once more in 1314. However, the king tempered his foreign losses with a new favorite, Hugh le Despencer. Like with Gaveston before, Despencer and his family grew increasingly powerful as King Edward's favorites. But the barons of England had had enough. A fresh civil war broke out, which saw an army led by the Earl of Lancaster, Gaveston's killer, face off against the crown and her royal forces. After 5 years of bloodshed, King Edward II emerged victorious. The Earl of Lancaster got a taste of his own medicine and was beheaded at Pontefract Castle in 1326. The Despencer clan, whose power had been growing even before the war, now saw their influence skyrocket across England. With the barons defeated, Isabella was once again forced to step in. With backing from the French crown, Queen Isabella raised an army and marched against her husband. Aided by her longtime lover Roger Mortimer, the king defeated King Edward and his army, captured Hugh le Despencer, and tried the young chamberlain with treason. Despencer was, unsurprisingly, found guilty and hung, drawn, and quartered for his crimes. Fearing that her husband would once again undermine her, Queen Isabella forced King Edward II to abdicate his throne. It was decided that their son, Edward III, would take over in his place. He was only 15 when the English crown came to rest on his head, but the young king already had a big mess ahead of him to clean up. His father's unorthodox style of governance had left England in a financially precarious position, and the crown's influence had been steadily undermined by the barons who administered the lands. But before he could set about fixing his kingdom, he would have to wait to come of age. In the meantime, his mother Isabella and Roger Mortimer ruled as regents in his place. However, King Edward hated this. Mortimer held all the power, and Edward grew resentful of his mother, who always sided with her lover on courtly matters. In 1330, on the eve of his 18th birthday, King Edward III rebelled against his regents, having his mother's lover hanged and taking full control over the English crown. With power now firmly his, Edward did what most medieval kings do. He waged war. Turning his attention to the newly independent Kingdom of Scotland, he mounted a successful campaign against them, crushing their army and retaking land his father had lost. But these gains were hard to hold on to, and soon a new conflict would demand all of King Edward's attention. In 1337, King Philip VI of France confiscated the English king's Duchy of Aquitaine, a move that greatly angered Edward. Instead of seeking a peaceful resolution like his father had, King Edward responded by laying claim to the French throne. He didn't know it, but this would be the start of a long and bloody conflict that would come to claim the lives of millions, outliving him and his grandsons. As the grandson of Philip IV of France, Edward did technically have a claim to the French throne, but because of the newly set precedent of agnatic succession, which only gave the male heirs a claim to succession, Edward's link through his mother was rejected by the French courts. Regardless, King Edward III was ready to fight. After some initial setbacks, the first phase of the war went well for England. Their success at Crécy and Poitiers led to the highly favorable Treaty of Bretigny, which saw England make territorial gains on the continent, but forced Edward to renounce his claim to the French throne. This was by no means a peace treaty, and fighting quickly resumed between the two kingdoms. But by this point, either side had other, greater problems to deal with. All of Europe, in fact, was reeling as a result of the single most deadly event in human history. In 1348, the Black Death had arrived in England. Pus-filled tumors, bile and blood, the streets of London were littered with the rotting corpses of the dead. Believed by many to be a curse from God himself, the bubonic plague claimed anywhere between 1/3 to half of the population of Europe in just 5 years. King Edward was fortunate enough to avoid contact with the disease, which spread in the cramped and overcrowded living conditions of England's major cities and decimated the normal population. The plague did more to accelerate social change than any singular event in English history before it. The unimaginably high death toll led to a labor shortage that severely impacted the English economy. With fewer hands to work the fields, many landowners were forced to enclose their lands, switching from traditional labor-intensive crop farming to the comparatively less labor-intensive sheep herding. Raising sheep required 1/5 of the manpower, and feudal lords allowed peasants who had previously been tied to their land in a style of serfdom to purchase their freedom and leave. A new class emerged: free laborers. People who had been previously bound to an area for generations were now free to move about, and many settled in the large cities that had been devastated by the plague. This switch to sheep herding and wool farming would also transform the English economy in the coming years. But more on that later. As a result, by the end of his reign, King Edward III's kingdom looked almost unrecognizable. He had transformed England into one of the most formidable military powers in Europe, further developed legislation in the role of government, and completely revamped the economy, ushering in a golden age as England recovered from the Black Death. His 50 years on the English throne made him the longest ruling king the English throne had ever seen. but those final years were dominated by sickness and ill health. He died on the 21st of June, 1377, having outlived his own son, the Black Prince. The crown was instead passed on to Edward's grandson, Richard II. Richard was a young king, first wearing the crown at just 10 years of age, which meant, like his grandfather before him, he was forced to rely on the regency of others while he came of age. John of Gaunt was the first virtual ruler to take over. He had stepped in during King Edward's final years when sickness and age kept the king bound to bed, and continued to rule after King Richard's coronation in 1337. There was just one problem. Edward's long reign had by no means been easy, and by now, the cracks that had started to form previously were on the verge of entirely breaking apart. You see, the English treasury had been stretched to its limits as it struggled to keep financing the ongoing 100 Years' War. France was larger and wealthier than England, and so had no problem pouring vast amounts of money behind their armies. Specifically during this time, there was a very real fear of a French invasion on the island, and the English army was in no position to challenge it. So, John of Gaunt introduced a new poll tax that required every person over the age of 15 to pay 1 shilling towards the war effort on the continent. This was not an insignificant amount of money for people at the time, and the peasantry strongly opposed the new tax. With the post-plague economic boom now firmly over, peasants had returned to low-paying work in an effort to keep food on the table. Alongside this, landowners in England had been trying to reintroduce servility and serfdom back to the land, and all these factors combined to form one major event that threatened King Richard's rule immensely. Led by the priest John Ball, a mob of 100,000 people marched on London demanding the new poll tax be abolished, a major uprising known as the Peasants' Revolt. The crowd was unruly, and within hours of their arrival in the capital, a destructive rampage broke out. The protesters burnt down the Savoy Palace, home of John of Gaunt, and even murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury. Faced with little choice, King Richard II and the Lord Mayor of London met with the demonstrators in a field just outside the city to discuss their terms. The conversation began amicably enough, but one of the other leaders, Wat Tyler, grew abusive and demanded more than the king and mayor would concede. Offended, the Lord Mayor of London drew his sword and killed Tyler on the spot. Fearing that the crowd would turn violent again, the young king made an extraordinarily brave move. Standing before the crowd, he shouted to the peasants to follow him. Leading them away from their leader's dead body, he promised that he would enact the reforms they had insisted on and successfully disperse the crowd. These were, however, hollow promises. Immediately after the protesters had returned home, the king's council of advisors revoked any concessions made by their ruler and swiftly set about crushing the rebels. The leaders of the Peasants' Revolt were tried and hanged as traitors for their crimes. The king never forgot the actions of his council, and this episode ignited a deep sense of mistrust between himself and his advisors. As a result, his inner circle shrank until it only included 3 men, who in turn became extremely powerful due to their closeness to the king. The other nobles became resentful of this favoritism and feared that their power would soon diminish as a result. Banding together, a group of powerful lords united to form a group called the Lords Appellant. They seized control of the English government in 1387 and demanded the king expel his inner circle from court. A period of instability followed and culminated in the king being forced to banish or execute those closest to him. For the next decade, the fragile peace held, and King Richard was slowly able to re-establish royal authority and bring it away from the merciless parliament of the Lords Appellant. In 1397, the king had amassed enough support to get his revenge. In a period that historians would come to call Richard's tyranny, the king captured, tried, and executed a number of the appellant lords. In 1398, Richard's tyranny went a step further, as he declared all acts of the merciless parliament to be null and void. He then delegated all parliamentary power to a committee of 12 lords and 6 commoners, each chosen by the king himself, effectively making Richard an absolute ruler who no longer needed Parliament's support. But there still existed a threat to Richard's rule: House Lancaster. At its head sat John of Gaunt, who represented the most powerful non-royal household on the island. King Richard had exiled John's son, Henry Bolingbroke, during his initial takeover a year before. But House Lancaster still stood in his way. Not only did they possess enormous wealth, but they were royal descendants, John being King Edward III's youngest surviving son. As a result, it was the wish of many in the land that House Lancaster would succeed a childless Richard to the English throne. Lucky for Richard, though, John of Gaunt died in 1399, giving the king time to secure his power. He had John's son, Henry Bolingbroke, who he'd exiled to France, disowned, confiscating his lands and effectively stripping Bolingbroke of his claim to the throne. Feeling as though he'd effectively dealt with the Lancastrian threat, Richard turned his attention to the growing Irish problem in the west. He amassed an army of 8,000 men and left England in May 1399, landing in Dublin within the week. But just a month later, trouble on the continent spilled over into England. Charles VI, King of France, had been deposed by Louis I, and the new French king saw a chance to gain the upper hand against his English foe. In a continuation of the 100 Years' War, Louis allowed Henry Bolingbroke to return to England with a small force, where Henry soon gathered more support and made a claim to the throne. With Richard off fighting in Ireland, Henry's arrival was entirely unchallenged. He gathered an army and soon defeated King Richard II in battle. The king was then imprisoned and later died of starvation while in the Tower of London. While Henry's claim to the throne was weak, it was unopposed by both the people and Parliament, and Henry Bolingbroke was crowned Henry IV on the 30th of September, 1399. The reign of Henry IV was marked by a series of firsts. He is believed to be the first king since the Normans had invaded in 1066 to address his people in English, as opposed to Norman French. He also hosted a visit from Manuel II Palaiologos shortly after his coronation in 1400, making this the only time a Byzantine emperor ever visited England. In 1406, English pirates captured the future James I of Scotland. Then, aged 11, off the coast of Yorkshire, the young prince would remain Henry's prisoner for the rest of his reign. Aside from that, though, the reign of King Henry IV was largely uneventful. He was mainly forced to deal with plots and rebellions from abroad, as well as a number of domestic assassination attempts on his life. He put down a rebellion in Wales against Owain Glyndŵr in 1400, and was forced to deal with a series of rebellions led by Henry Percy, 1st Earl of Northumberland in the north. The Percy Rebellion, as it came to be known, ended at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403, where Henry's eldest son, Henry of Monmouth, showed great military prowess, leading his troops in a decisive victory against Percy's forces. During the battle, though, Henry of Monmouth was struck by an arrow to the face, but luckily survived. During the last years of his rule, the rebellions had become more frequent. A rumor soon took hold in London that Richard II, who had died of starvation in the Tower of London, was actually still alive. This was all in spite of Henry's best efforts to prove Richard had died while in captivity. King Henry had the body of Richard on display at St. Paul Cathedral shortly after his death, in an effort to prove to his supporters that the old king had in fact died, and that his death had not been violent. However, this didn't stop Scottish emissaries from traveling throughout the villages of England, declaring that Richard was alive and residing at the Scottish court. Sir Elias Lyvet and his associate Thomas Clark searched for an appropriate lookalike and promised him Scottish aid to carry out the insurrection. Unsurprisingly, the rebellion came to nothing. Lyvet was released, and Clark was thrown into the Tower of London. Towards the end of his life, Henry was taken by recurring bouts of serious ill health. Henry died in London at the Abbot's House of Westminster Abbey and the Jerusalem Chamber during a convocation of Parliament. He was buried at Canterbury Cathedral, adjacent to the shrine of Thomas Becket. The English throne, in its entirety, would go on to his son, Henry of Monmouth. On April 9th, 1413, Henry of Monmouth was crowned Henry V at Westminster Abbey. On the day of his coronation, a terrible snowstorm blew over the crowds, but the king addressed his people despite it. Described as very tall, with a slim build and a ruddy complexion, the young king had developed a taste for battle during his father's reign before him. He'd helped quash the Welsh rebellion and personally commanded the royal army to victory at the Battle of Shrewsbury at just 16 years of age. But Henry V had inherited many of the same problems his father had dealt with. The Lancastrian claim had its fair share of doubters, and the young king immediately set about securing his position on the throne. He wanted to rule a unified England and not deal with the constant threat of pretenders and usurpers like his father had. He allowed his past indifferences to be forgotten, honorably reinterring the late Richard II, giving Richard's son, Edmund Mortimer, a place on the council, and gradually restoring titles and estates of those who had suffered under his father's reign. When he did face a serious threat, he proved a decisive decision-maker. He ruthlessly put down the Lollard discontent in 1414 and the Southampton plot of 1415, which involved a number of earls and barons who supported Edmund Mortimer's claim to the throne, which was easily dealt with as it failed to gain much popular support. Mortimer himself remained loyal to the king throughout the plot. He promoted the use of the English language in government, keeping records in English and using English in his personal correspondence for the first time since the Norman Conquest 350 years earlier. With his domestic situation now under control, Henry could turn his attention abroad. The Hundreds-Year War was still ongoing, despite a brief period of inactivity from both sides. In 1415, King Henry V took an army and landed at Harfleur in Normandy, intent on regaining territory on the continent. After a brief siege, Henry and his men take the city of Harfleur, but it's a costly victory. It had taken Henry longer than he would have liked, and his men had suffered. Having arrived in Normandy with 12,000 men, Henry's troops now numbered only 6,000 due to desertion, starvation, and disease. Against the advice of his council, he ordered his men to march across the French countryside towards the English-held port city of Calais, where they could rearm and return to England. Unable to cross the River Somme, Henry V was forced to make a detour inland where he was intercepted by French forces near the village of Agincourt. Henry's men were exhausted. The French army outnumbered them 5-1, and many of the rank and file were suffering from dysentery. Regardless, Henry had little choice but to meet the French in battle. Heavy rain the night before had made the ground around them a marshy bog, and as the astute tactician that he was, he intended to use that to his advantage. At 11 a.m., the French army attacked, mounting a cavalry charge straight at the main English line. Henry brought his archers forward and ordered them to unleash hell. With a 250-meter killing range, the English longbowmen slaughtered the French cavalry, who had been slowed down in the mud. Many were forced to dismount, and some drowned in the thick mud where they stood. By the time the cavalry reached the English line, Henry had ordered his archers to drive large, pointed stakes into the ground, a new tactic never before employed by the English against the French. The charge was rendered useless, and a melee broke out. Eventually, the English archers abandoned their bows and took to fighting hand-to-hand. The tide of the battle quickly turned in favor of the English, who hacked the French soldiers to death, many of whom were stuck in the mud due to their heavy armor. Before long, Henry was victorious. His army marched in Calais unopposed. When he returned to England just a few months later, he received a hero's welcome. Crowds lined the streets, pageants took place, and choirs sang in all the churches. It was a great moment of pride for England, and proved to be the greatest English victory of the 100 Years' War. From a practical standpoint, it greatly bolstered Henry V's claim to the French throne. It directly led to infighting within the French court, and by 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed, acknowledging Henry as regent and heir to the French throne. By now, Henry had regained control of Normandy, was allied with the Duchy of Burgundy, and had received support from King Sigismund of Hungary, who signed the Treaty of Canterbury, acknowledging the English claim to the throne. Unification of the kingdoms of England and France seemed inevitable. It was Henry's intention that after unifying the two crowns, he would embark on a crusade. However, he died just a few years later in 1422, passing the throne onto his son, Henry VI. While Henry V's reign was short, it transformed England into a powerful player in European politics and forged in her a new national identity. England once again had land on the continent, and under King Henry, England reached its territorial peak in mainland Europe. Henry VI was crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of September 1422. Young kings were nothing new in the realm, but Henry VI broke every English record, ascending to the throne at just 9 months old and becoming the youngest ever King of England. Still breastfeeding, the burden of administration quickly fell to regents who ruled England together. Just a few months after his coronation in England, the baby King Henry traveled to France and was crowned King of France at Notre Dame Cathedral, in accordance with the Treaty of Troyes his father had signed just a few years earlier. This made King Henry VI the only English king to also be crowned King of France in French territory. While he waited to come of age, Henry's mother Catherine remarried to Owen Tudor and had 2 sons, Edmund and Jasper. Henry gave his half-brothers earldoms in Normandy, and their influence would later have a huge impact on English history. By the time he reached 16, Henry had resumed full authoritative control over England. However, it came at a bad time. It was the beginning of the Great Slump, a period of economic decline that would last for the next 50 years and weaken the crown's power in the realm. Things were only further complicated by the king's problematic personality. Described as shy, passive, and utterly opposed to conflict and violence, Henry VI was nothing like his father, and these traits were undesirable of a king during the medieval times and made him appear weak in court. Had he been an able administrator, he might have salvaged some respect. But Henry would soon prove to be unreliable in a totally different way. The king was prone to debilitating bouts of madness that forced administrative decision-making back into the hands of regents. This made England unstable and weakened royal authority. It wasn't long before England declined into anarchy and lawlessness. Disaffected nobles sensed that the crown was weak and capitalized on this, quarreling with one another and amassing private armies to fight for local supremacy. The king would intermittently resume control, but with each bout of madness that afflicted him, his grip on the realm weakened. To make matters worse, the 100 Years' War that had now been raging for 5 generations would sputter to its end under Henry's watch. England had seen many successes and victories during its time, but by its conclusion, Henry had lost all of his father's lands in France, retaining only the port city of Calais, further adding to his image of a weak king. With his kingdom fracturing around him, it wasn't long before England broke out into civil war again. One of the more powerful noble houses had been slowly amassing support, while Henry struggled to keep a grip on his sanity. House York, who claimed descendancy from Edward III, the Plantagenet king who ruled before Henry Bolingbroke took the throne by force less than 100 years ago, was preparing to make its move on the English throne. In 1460, tensions finally erupted and the War of the Roses had begun. So named for the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, the Yorkist rebels scoured a quick and early victory at the Battle of Northampton on the 10th of July, 1460, capturing King Henry and making him a Yorkist prisoner. The Queen, however, was able to escape, traveling through Wales and into Scotland, where she sought refuge in the court of the Scottish Queen Regent, Mary of Guelders. After amassing an army of her own, she marched back into England seeking to rescue her imprisoned husband. After defeating the Yorkist army at the Battle of Wakefield, she marched her army south to St. Albans, where the king was being held. There, she engaged with the Earl of Warwick, defeating him and freeing the king from captivity. Henry's mental state at this time was so fractured that reports state that the king laughed and sang as the battle raged around him. The Lancastrian victories were short-lived, however, as Edward of York rallied his troops and met the royal army at the Battle of Towton in 1461. Under a thick blanket of snow, the Battle of Towton became the bloodiest battle that ever took place on English soil, and resulted in a decisive Yorkist victory. Edward deposed Henry VI from the throne and hastily crowned himself King of England. Despite this, though, the war would continue as Henry fled the battle and became a fugitive in his own kingdom. Henry VI was eventually betrayed by the Black Monk of Addington and captured by Yorkist forces. The new King Edward decided to spare the Mad King's life, instead putting him in the Tower of London. Edward of York was crowned Edward IV on the 28th of June 1461, following his victories against the Lancastrian army. As a usurper, the new king desperately needed parliamentary support to back his claim, but many of the lords in England still supported the old King Henry and chose to stay neutral during the conflict. This forced Edward to rely heavily on a small group of noblemen, mainly Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. This over-reliance would directly lead to King Edward IV losing his grip on the English crown. Warwick had advised the king to marry either Anne of France or Bona of Savoy to strengthen England's ties with France, and effectively outmaneuver the Duchy of Burgundy, which had been growing in power and influence in Europe over the last decade. Edward, however, had other ideas. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a woman of considerably lower social class than the king, and a widow, but someone who historians claim was enchanting nonetheless. This enraged Warwick, who began to seek allies elsewhere. In 1467, King Edward dealt Warwick another humiliating blow, dismissing his brother from his position as Lord Chancellor. By now, though, Warwick had amassed enough support to challenge the unpopular king. He traveled to London with an army and intended to remove the evil councillors that had taken hold of the English government. With the king preoccupied in the north, Neville's army was easily able to defeat the royal troops at Edgecote Moor in 1469. The king's father-in-law, Richard Woodville, alongside his youngest son Richard, were captured and executed at Kenilworth. However, it quickly became apparent that Warwick had little support in the capital, and Edward, who had been captured and imprisoned at Middleham Castle, was released and allowed to resume the throne. What followed was a period of tense stability. Warwick was ousted from Edward's courts and decided on traveling to France, where he sought support from the continent and vowed to restore Henry VI, who was currently still alive in the Tower of London, to the English throne. Yorkist rule had become increasingly unpopular, and Warwick was able to gather an army of 30,000 men in support of his cause. Landing back in England on the 9th of September 1470, King Edward was no match for Warwick's army, and he fled to Bruges to avoid capture. Warwick restored King Henry VI to the throne. But with this, the same problems that had plagued the Mad King's reign simply returned. Mental instability meant a lack of central leadership, and caused the nobility to fight amongst itself for power, like it had previously. Edward, meanwhile, returned to England aided by powerful Flemish merchants, and immediately sought support in York. Marching through the realm, he slowly gathered an army and turned his attention to the capital. He entered London unopposed and imprisoned Henry VI once again. Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet in 1471. While a second Lancastrian army was defeated at the Battle of Tewkesbury only a month later. Henry's only son, Edward of Westminster, died on the battlefield, while Henry himself passed away less than a year later. With the old king and his heir dead, King Edward had hoped his throne would now be secure. But the realm was in disarray, plagued by instability and infighting after years of civil war. King Edward was able to maintain his grip on power, but toward the end of his reign, he became increasingly ill and died on the 9th of April, 1483. His son, Edward V, was to take over as King of England. But as Edward was only little, the king named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector and Regent while Edward came of age. But Edward would never be crowned, and England would soon discover that the new Lord Protector had little intention of vacating his position on the throne. Richard took over as Lord Protector of the realm immediately after the death of his brother, King Edward IV. Royal records do show that plans were made for Edward V's coronation, but there is great debate among scholars as to how much of this was genuine, or merely a show put on by the new Lord Protector to appease the old king's supporters. Richard's reputation as a ruthless power grabber initially stems from the speed with which he took control of the English crown. Shortly after his appointment as Lord Protector, he brutally put down a supposed plot against his life that involved the new king's uncles, Anthony Woodville. Upon the Queen's request, Richard and Anthony Woodville were to meet at Northampton and accompany the young Edward down to the capital, providing him safety and legitimacy as he ascended the throne. But while the young king waited for the arrival of his uncles, Richard got to work. He had Anthony Woodville and his associates arrested and sent to Pontefract Castle, where the men were tried and executed for an alleged plot against the new Lord Protector's life. Richard quickly notified his nephew of the treasonous actions of his uncle and reassured the boy that they had been dealt with accordingly. He alone led Edward into London and transferred the boy to the royal apartments in the Tower of London, as was customary for any king awaiting his coronation. But Richard's plan was only just beginning. Upon hearing the news of her brother's demise, the Dowager Queen fled to the capital and sought support from those who had been loyal to her husband. But Richard had beaten her to it. He accused those close to the Queen of being complicit in the plot against his life and had them executed within days of the trial. With the Woodvilles' power base in tatters, Richard had only one obstacle in between himself and the English throne: the princes in the Tower. As luck would have it, the Lord Protector was informed by the Bishop of Bath and Wells that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was in fact invalid, due to King Edward still having been married to Eleanor Butler at the time of his union with Woodville. This meant that Edward and Richard, the princes in the Tower, were illegitimate and could not rule. A sermon was preached on the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral on the day of the new king's coronation, declaring Edward V to be a bastard and asserting that Richard III was the rightful heir to the English throne. Shortly after this, the citizens of London and its nobility converged and drew up a petition asking Richard to assume direct control of the throne. On the 6th of July, 1483, Lord Protector Richard was crowned Richard III, King of England. Power was his. That same summer, the princes who had been quietly living in the Tower silently disappeared. There are many theories as to what happened, from being murdered by Richard himself to fleeing to Europe under the cover of darkness. But the mystery of the princes in the Tower still remains one of the greatest unsolved questions in English history. But, despite the ease with which Richard had assumed the throne, his power base was still fragile, and it wasn't long before he was faced with his first major threat: the Buckingham Rebellion. Led by the Earl of Buckingham and a number of disaffected nobility who had been fiercely loyal to the old King Edward IV, they quietly planned to overthrow the new King Richard. They saw the new regime for what it was: a power grab, and they sought to give the crown back to the young Prince Edward, currently in the Tower of London. But when rumors of Prince Edward's death began to circulate throughout the realm, Buckingham had to change his plan. Luckily for him, there was another candidate ready and willing just to cross the channel: Henry Tudor. As the son of Lady Margaret Beaufort, herself a descendant of King Edward III, Henry had a legal claim to the English throne, regardless of how weak it actually was. Buckingham gathered his troops in Wales, while Henry Tudor, who had been exiled to France, gathered an army on the continent. However, just like it had in 1066, Bad weather once again played an important part in the fate of England, as Henry and his ships were delayed crossing the English Channel by a fierce storm. Most of his fleet was forced to turn back to their ports in Normandy and Calais, while Henry himself anchored at Plymouth to wait out the gale. Buckingham's army was troubled by the same storm on land, and when Richard's troops arrived to face the rebel army, many of Buckingham's